The courtroom was quiet, too quiet. Outside, the usual city sounds hummed in the background, distant car horns, the occasional siren, footsteps on the sidewalk. But inside courtroom 3B, you could hear a pin drop. Everyone sat stiff in their chairs, eyes fixed on the bench at the front of the room. The air felt heavy, like before a storm. At the center of it all sat the judge. She wasn't just stern. She carried herself like she owned the room, like the law bent to her, not the other way around. Her black robe hung perfectly, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it might hurt. She tapped her pen against the desk with slow, impatient clicks, clearly annoyed that the docket wasn't moving fast enough. The case on the schedule wasn't even a real trial, just a minor civil motion, the kind that usually gets handled in 10 minutes and forgotten by lunchtime. But today something was off. A man had shown up without a lawyer, holding a manila folder and wearing a plain dark suit that looked a little too ordinary for this place. He didn't strut in like he owned the room. He didn't wave papers around or demand attention. He just walked in, nodded to the clerk, and waited his turn like everyone else. When his name was called, he stepped forward calmly. No swagger, no nervous fidgeting, just quiet confidence. He placed his folder on the counsel table and looked up at the bench. "Your Honor," he began, voice low but clear. "I'm here to file a motion regarding—" "Let me guess," the judge cut in, not even looking up from her notes. "Another self-represented litigant who thinks the court exists to fix their personal problems?" A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff glanced toward the door as if expecting someone to intervene, but the man didn't flinch. He just stood there, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "I'm not here about a personal matter, Your Honor," he said evenly. "This is an official filing related to an ongoing federal review." That got her attention. Briefly, she finally looked up, eyebrows raised, lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Federal review? In my courtroom? That's rich." She let out a short laugh, turning slightly to the court reporter as if sharing a private joke. "Do you have any idea how many people walk in here claiming they've got some federal business? Half of them can't even spell jurisdiction." The man didn't react. No sigh, no eye roll, no defensive posture. He simply waited. That calmness seemed to irritate her even more. She leaned forward, voice dripping with condescension. "Let me make this simple for you. This is a state court. We handle real cases, contracts, evictions, custody disputes, not whatever fantasy paperwork you printed off the internet. If you're not a licensed attorney, and you're not a party to an actual case on my docket, then you're wasting my time. And frankly," she added, glancing at the clock, "I don't have time for amateurs." A few lawyers in the back exchanged glances. One shook his head almost imperceptibly. It wasn't just that she was being rude. It was that she was being reckless. Judges don't usually talk to people like that unless they're absolutely sure of who they're dealing with. But she seemed certain this man was nobody, just another nuisance. Yet the man still didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just reached slowly into his inside jacket pocket. The bailiff tensed slightly, but the man moved deliberately, not suddenly. He pulled out a small leather wallet and opened it just enough to show the badge clipped inside. Then, without drama, he placed it on the edge of the counsel table facing the bench. The judge squinted. Her smirk faltered for half a second, but then she waved it off. "Oh, please, a badge? You think flashing a piece of plastic impresses me? I've had process servers, repo men, even private investigators try that trick. If you've got something real, file it through proper channels. Otherwise, step aside." The man nodded slowly as if he'd expected this. "I understand your caution, Your Honor, but I'm not here to serve papers or collect a debt. I'm here under federal authority to execute a sealed warrant issued by the U.S. District Court." Now the room really went still. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. The judge's eyes narrowed. "A warrant? For whom?" "For you." That word hung in the air like a thunderclap. She laughed, but it was sharp, forced. "Don't be ridiculous. You think I'm going to believe some man in a discount suit just walked into my courtroom and is about to arrest me? On what grounds? Who even are you?" "My name isn't important," he said gently. But my credentials are. He slid a folded document across the table toward her. This is a certified copy of the arrest warrant. Charges include obstruction of justice, accepting bribes in exchange for favorable rulings, and tampering with court records. The investigation has been active for 6 months. Her face went pale. Not dramatically, just a slow draining of color, like someone had turned down a dimmer switch. She picked up the paper with trembling fingers, scanning it quickly. Her breathing changed. The pen she'd been tapping? It rolled off the desk and hit the floor with a soft clatter. "You're lying," she whispered, more to herself than to him. This can't be real, but it was, and everyone in the room knew it now. The way the man stood, no anger, no triumph, just duty, told the whole story. He wasn't enjoying this. He was doing a job. The judge looked around as if searching for someone to tell her it was a joke. The bailiff avoided her gaze. The clerk stared at her keyboard. Even the lawyers, who'd seen all kinds of courtroom drama, looked stunned into silence. She opened her mouth to speak, maybe to protest, maybe to demand a lawyer, but no sound came out. Instead, she slowly pushed back her chair and stood. The robe she wore suddenly looked too big for her, like it belonged to someone else. I need to make a call," she said, voice shaky. "I'm afraid that won't be possible right now," the man replied, still calm. "Standard procedure. You'll be allowed to contact counsel once you're processed." She swallowed hard. Then, with a dignity that surprised even herself, she reached up and unfastened the clasp of her robe. She folded it neatly over the back of her chair, the same chair she'd sat in for years, handing down rulings that shaped people's lives. Now, her own life was about to change forever. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars passed. People walked to lunch. But inside courtroom 3B, time had stopped, and in just 7 minutes everything had flipped upside down. The quiet man hadn't come to argue. He hadn't come to shame her, though shame would surely follow. He'd come because the system for HOA, all its flaws, sometimes works exactly as it should. Quietly, firmly, and without warning. Especially when those in power forget they're not above it. And as the judge stood there, no longer behind the bench but just another person facing consequences, the only sound was the soft rustle of papers and the heavy weight of justice finally catching up. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was thick, like walking through fog. Everyone held their breath. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower, as if it too was watching what came next. The man in the plain suit didn't move fast. He didn't reach for cuffs or bark orders. He just stood there, calm as ever, letting the weight of what he'd said sink in. The judge, still standing beside her empty chair, stared at the folded paper in her hands like it might burst into flames. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't drop it. "You've got this wrong," she finally said. Voice lower now, almost pleading. "There's been a mistake. I don't know what you think you've found, but I've done nothing wrong." The man tilted his head slightly, not in judgment but in quiet acknowledgement. "I understand this is a shock," he said. "But the warrant is real. The evidence has been reviewed by federal prosecutors. And the order to execute it came directly from a district judge, not someone who takes that lightly." She looked around again, searching for an ally, for someone to say, "Wait, let's slow down," but no one spoke. The bailiff shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the floor. The court reporter stopped typing. Even the attorneys who'd been whispering in the back row were frozen, as if afraid that moving might draw attention to themselves. Then, something changed in her expression. The panic gave way to something harder, defiance. She straightened her shoulders and looked the man dead in the eye. "Fine," she said, voice regaining some of its old sharpness. "If you're so sure, then prove it. Show me the evidence. Right here. Right now." A risky move. Most people in her position would have stayed quiet, asked for a lawyer, tried to buy time. But pride was a stubborn thing, especially for someone used to being in control. The man didn't flinch. "I'm not here to argue the case," he said gently. "My role is to serve the warrant, not present the prosecution's file. That will happen in court, your court, but a different one." She scoffed. "So you expect me to just walk out of here like some common criminal, based on your word and a piece of paper?" "No," he said. "I expect you to respect the law you swore to uphold." That hit harder than any accusation. For a moment, her mask slipped completely. You could see it, the flicker of shame beneath the anger. She'd spent years lecturing others about decorum, about consequences, about the sanctity of the bench. And now, she was being held to the same standard. Before she could respond, the courtroom doors opened quietly. 2 uniformed officers stepped in. Not local police, but federal deputies, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They moved with quiet efficiency, nodding to the man in the suit but saying nothing. They'd been waiting outside just in case. The judge's breath caught. This wasn't theater. This was real. One of the deputies stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, voice neutral but firm, "please turn around and place your hands behind your back." She hesitated, not out of resistance but disbelief. This was her courtroom, her domain, the place where she decided fates, where people stood when she entered, where her word was final. And now she was being asked to turn around like a suspect in a lineup. But she did it. Slowly, stiffly, she turned. Her hands trembled as she brought them behind her back. The click of the cuffs was soft, but in that silent room it echoed like a gavel slamming shut. A gasp came from the gallery. Someone covered their mouth. Another person quietly stood and slipped out the back, unable to watch. The man in the suit watched it all without expression. Not satisfaction, not pity, just duty. He picked up his folder, closed it neatly, and tucked it under his arm. As the deputies guided the judge toward the side exit, away from the public hallway, to spare her at least that small dignity, he turned to the clerk. "Please inform the Chief Judge's office that courtroom 3B is temporarily unavailable, and cancel the rest of today's docket." The clerk nodded, still wide-eyed, and reached for the phone. Outside, the world kept turning. A delivery truck rumbled past. A couple argued on the sidewalk. But inside, the air still felt charged, like after lightning strikes. Later, people would talk about how fast it all happened. 1 minute, she was scolding a stranger for wasting her time. 7 minutes later, she was being led out in handcuffs by that same stranger. It sounded like something from a movie, except it wasn't scripted. It wasn't exaggerated. It was just human, because here's what no one saw coming. The man hadn't come to humiliate her. He'd come because over months of quiet observation, investigators had traced a pattern. Favors granted to certain lawyers, cases mysteriously dismissed, bank deposits that didn't match a judge's salary. Small things at first, but they added up. And in the end, it wasn't a grand sting operation with flashing lights. It was a single man walking into a courtroom, calm and prepared, doing a job that needed doing. Back in the gallery, a young law student sat frozen, notebook open but untouched. He'd come to observe routine hearings to get a feel for how real courtrooms operated. Instead, he'd just witnessed something far more important. That power doesn't protect you from accountability. In fact, it often makes you more visible. The man in the suit paused at the door. He glanced back once, not at the bench, not at the empty chair, but at the American flag in the corner of the room. Then he stepped out, disappearing into the hallway without fanfare. No one clapped. No one cheered. There was no victory here, just correction. The system, flawed as it may be, had worked. Not because of drama or outrage, but because someone did their job quietly, thoroughly, and without ego. And as the courtroom emptied, clerks packing up files, attorneys whispering in hushed tones, the bailiff locking the gate, the only thing left behind was the echo of a truth everyone knew but rarely saw in action. No one is above the law. Not even the person who sits behind the bench. The judge would get her day in court. She'd have lawyers, motions, appeals. But none of that could undo what had just happened. In 7 minutes, her world had tilted. And the quiet man who caused it? He was already on his way to the next assignment, name unknown, face forgettable. Exactly how people like him are trained to be. Because real justice doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to show up and do what's right. The moment the courtroom doors closed behind the judge, the air inside seemed to exhale. People who'd been holding their breath finally let it out. A few stood up slowly, as if waking from a dream. Others stayed seated, staring at the empty bench like it might suddenly explain what had just happened. But there was no explanation coming. Just silence and the heavy realization that something rare had just unfolded. Not a scandal whispered about later. Not a rumor that would fade by next week. This was real, public, undeniable. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun beat down on the steps. A small crowd had gathered. Not protesters, not reporters with cameras, just curious onlookers drawn by the unusual sight of federal vehicles parked out front. When the judge appeared between two deputies, hands cuffed behind her back, a hush fell over them. No one shouted. No one took pictures. They just watched, stunned, as she was guided toward a waiting sedan. She kept her head high, but her steps were slower now, heavier. The robe was gone. The gavel was silent. All that remained was a person, flawed, exposed, and facing the same system she'd once controlled. Back inside, the man in the plain suit was already gone. He hadn't lingered for questions or applause. He'd done what he came to do and slipped away like a shadow. That was the thing about people in his line of work. They weren't there to be seen. They were there to make sure the rules applied to everyone, even those who thought the rules didn't touch them. Meanwhile, in the clerk's office down the hall, phones began to ring. Word spread fast. Judges from other courtrooms called to confirm if it was true. The chief judge's office issued a brief statement. An administrative matter is under review. Court operations will continue as scheduled. Vague, careful, professional, but everyone knew what it meant. By mid-afternoon, lawyers in the building were talking in low voices over coffee. Some expressed shock. Others quietly said they weren't surprised. She always played favorites, one muttered. If you knew the right people, your case moved faster. If you didn't, good luck. Another added. I saw her dismiss a motion last month without even reading it. Said the paperwork looked sloppy. Turned out the guy was representing himself after losing his job. It wasn't one big crime that brought her down. It was 100 little ones, small cuts to fairness, tiny betrayals of trust that added up over time. And now someone had finally added them all together. At the Federal Detention Center downtown, the judge went through processing like anyone else. Fingerprints, mugshot, personal items logged and bagged. She asked for a lawyer immediately, and one was called, a respected defense attorney known for handling public officials. He arrived within the hour, calm and composed, already preparing for the storm ahead. But even he couldn't undo what had already been seen. Video from the courtroom hadn't been released, but enough people had witnessed it firsthand. Word traveled faster than any press release. By evening, local news stations were reporting the arrest. Careful not to say guilty, but clear about the charges. Obstruction, bribery, abuse of power. Yet the story that stuck in people's minds wasn't the legal jargon. It was the image of a powerful woman, used to commanding every room, being brought low, not by a mob or a politician, but by a quiet man who simply showed up with the truth. In a diner a few blocks from the courthouse, two paralegals sat over coffee, still buzzing. Did you see her face when he said the warrant is for you? One asked, eyes wide. It was like she'd seen a ghost. The other nodded. I've been in that courtroom for 3 years. She yelled at a single mom last week for being 5 minutes late. Called her irresponsible. And now? She's the one in cuffs. That was the part that stuck with people. Not just that she'd broken the law, but that she'd forgotten what the law was for. It wasn't a tool for control. It wasn't a weapon to shame the vulnerable. It was meant to protect everyone equally. And when someone in power forgets that, the fall is always harder. Back at the courthouse, cleanup began. Not physical cleanup, the room was spotless, but the kind you can't see. Files were pulled. Cases she'd presided over were flagged for review. Internal Affairs launched a full audit. Would some rulings be overturned? Probably. Would people get new hearings? Maybe. Justice once bent doesn't snap back instantly. It takes time, care, and humility, something that had been missing for a long while. And through it all, the quiet man remained unseen. No interviews. No photo in the paper. Just a job done. Because in real life, heroes don't wear capes or give speeches. Sometimes they wear plain suits and speak in calm voices and walk into rooms where no one expects them to be the one holding the power. Later that night, in a small apartment across town, the man sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea. No celebration, no sense of triumph. Just quiet reflection. He'd seen this before. People who started with good intentions, then got comfortable, then got careless. Power wasn't evil, but it was dangerous when mixed with pride. And pride, he knew, was the quietest kind of corruption. He thought about the young law student who'd been in the gallery, notebook in hand. He hoped the kid remembered this day not as a spectacle, but as a lesson. That respect for the law isn't about titles or robes or who stands where in a courtroom. It's about doing what's right even when no one's watching, especially when you're the one in charge. Outside his window, the city lights flickered on one by one. Life went on, but somewhere a message had been sent, clear, quiet, and impossible to ignore. The bench is not a throne. It's a responsibility, and when that responsibility is betrayed, the system has a way of correcting itself, not with noise, not with rage, but with a folded warrant, a calm voice, and 7 minutes that change everything. No one would forget what happened in courtroom 3B that day. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, and sometimes truth is the most powerful story of all. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but underneath everything shifted. The courthouse still opened at 8 a.m., clerks still filed motions, lawyers still argued cases, and bailiffs still called out, "All rise." But something had changed. People moved differently, spoke more carefully, watched each other a little closer. No one talked openly about what happened, not in hallways, not in break rooms, but you could feel it. A new kind of respect had settled in, not for authority but for accountability, because now everyone knew. The system could reach even the highest chair in the room. Meanwhile, downtown, the investigation continued. Federal agents combed through months of records, bank statements, phone logs, sealed case files. They interviewed clerks, attorneys, even janitors who'd overheard things late at night. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. It wasn't just one bribe or one favor. It was a pattern, small, calculated, and repeated. Rulings tilted for certain lawyers. Cases delayed or rushed based on who was paying attention. And always, the judge at the center of it, convinced no one would notice. Or care. But someone had noticed. And they'd cared enough to do something about it. Back in the courtroom where it all began, a temporary judge now sat on the bench, a retired jurist brought in to restore trust. On their first day, they paused before the first case and said something simple but powerful. This court belongs to the people, not to any one person. Fairness isn't optional. It's the foundation. Those words spread, not in headlines but in whispers between litigants, in nods between public defenders and prosecutors, in the way people stood a little straighter when they entered the room. As for the man in the plain suit, he returned to his office like any other day. No fanfare, no special recognition. His colleagues knew what he'd done, of course, but they didn't make a show of it. In their world, success wasn't measured in applause. It was measured in integrity upheld, in lines not crossed, in justice served without spectacle. Still, people wondered about him. Who was he? How long had he been watching? Did he know when he walked in that morning exactly how it would end? The truth was simpler than the rumors. He hadn't planned to arrest her in open court. That wasn't the goal. But when she mocked him, when she assumed he was nobody, that arrogance confirmed what the evidence already suggested. She truly believed the rules didn't apply to her. And in that moment, the team made a call. To it now. Let it happen where everyone can see. Not for shame, but for clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful message isn't whispered behind closed doors. It's spoken in a room full of witnesses. News outlets covered the story carefully. They stuck to facts. Charges filed, bail set, court dates scheduled. They avoided calling her corrupt outright, because in this country everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But the footage of her being let out, though never officially released, lived in people's minds. Not as gossip, but as a reminder, power doesn't protect you. It exposes you. In neighborhoods far from the courthouse, people talked about it over dinner. A bus driver mentioned it to his regular passenger. A teacher used it as a lesson in her civics class, not to scare students but to show them that systems can work when people stay honest. It's not about one bad judge, she told her class. It's about what happens when good people pay attention. And that was the real story, not the fall of one person, but the quiet courage of those who refused to look away. Weeks later, during a routine oversight hearing, a state senator asked the head of judicial ethics a simple question. How do we prevent this from happening again? The answer wasn't flashy. No new laws, no dramatic reforms. Just this. Transparency, training, and a culture that values humility over hierarchy. Because the problem wasn't just what the judge did, it was the environment that let it go unnoticed for so long. Colleagues who stayed silent, staff who feared speaking up, a system that rewarded results over integrity. Fixing that wouldn't happen overnight. But it had to start somewhere, and it started with 7 minutes in a courtroom. Back at the federal building, the quiet man prepared his official report. Page after page of facts, dates, communications. No opinions, no drama, just the truth laid out plainly. When he finished, he closed the file and placed it in the outgoing tray. Another case closed. Another thread of trust restored. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He was just someone who showed up, did the work, and believed deeply that fairness mattered. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. Later that evening, he walked home through the city streets. The air was cool, the sidewalks quiet. He passed a young couple arguing over directions, a street musician playing softly for spare change, an old man feeding pigeons in the park. Ordinary life moving forward, and in that moment he felt it, the weight of what he did, not as a burden but as a privilege. To protect the space where ordinary people could walk into a courtroom and believe they'd be treated fairly, no matter who they were or what they wore. That was worth more than any title, any robe, any gavel. The judge, meanwhile, remained out on bail, awaiting trial. She'd hired a strong legal team, and her case would likely drag on for months. But the real judgment had already happened, not in a verdict, but in the eyes of everyone who'd watched her lose the one thing she thought she could never lose: respect. And as the city slept that night, the courthouse stood silent under the moonlight. Empty chairs, closed files, a bench waiting for the next person to sit on it. And remember that justice isn't about power. It's about responsibility. The quiet man knew that, and because of people like him, so would everyone else. Months passed. Seasons turned. The courthouse kept its rhythm, cases filed, hearings held, verdicts delivered. But something lingered in the air, subtle but real, like the quiet after a storm has passed. People moved with a little more care. Judges listened a little longer. Lawyers double-checked their filings. Even the clerk seemed to handle documents with extra attention, as if each one carried weight beyond paper and ink. The judge's trial never became the media circus some expected. There were no dramatic courtroom outbursts, no last-minute confessions. Just facts presented calmly one after another, bank records showing unexplained deposits, emails arranging private meetings with attorneys whose cases always seemed to go smoothly, testimony from court staff who'd stayed silent for too long out of fear or loyalty. Piece by piece, the picture filled in, not with rage, but with quiet certainty. In the end, she pleaded guilty to reduced charges. Not because she admitted everything, but because the evidence left her no real choice. She avoided prison time, but lost her license to practice law, her pension, and perhaps hardest of all, her place in the legal community she'd once led. She disappeared from public view, moving to a small town where no one knew her name or her past. Some said she volunteered at a local food bank. Others said she never spoke of the law again. Whatever the truth, her story became a footnote, a cautionary tale told in law schools and ethics trainings. This is what happens when you forget who the system is for. But the real legacy wasn't in her fall. It was in what rose in its place. The courthouse where it all happened quietly changed. New training sessions were added. Not just on legal procedure, but on humility, on bias, on the simple act of listening. A suggestion box appeared in the clerk's office, not as a formality, but as a real channel for concerns. And when a new judge was appointed to that bench, they made a point of meeting with public defenders, legal aid workers, even people who'd represented themselves in civil cases. "I want to understand what this place feels like from your side of the railing," they said. That shift didn't happen because of a law or a policy memo. It happened because people remembered those 7 minutes, the way a quiet man walked in, spoke plainly, and reminded everyone that no robe makes you untouchable. As for that man, he never gave interviews, never wrote a book, never sought credit. He simply returned to his work, case after case, city after city, doing what needed to be done without fanfare. To most, he remained invisible. A face in a crowd, a voice on a phone line, a name on a report no one outside the agency would ever read. But to those who understood the weight of his role, he represented something rare: consistency. The kind of quiet courage that doesn't need a spotlight to do what's right. Years later, a young public defender, someone who'd been in the gallery that day as a law student, found herself standing before a judge in that same courtroom. She was nervous, representing a client who couldn't afford a lawyer, facing an experienced prosecutor. But as she stepped up to the podium, she remembered the silence that fell when the gavel stopped sounding. She remembered how power, when unchecked, can rot from the inside. And she remembered that fairness isn't given. It's guarded every single day by ordinary people choosing to care. She spoke clearly, asked for what her client deserved. And the judge, new thoughtful, listening, granted a fair hearing. No shortcuts, no smirks, just justice, plain and simple. That moment wouldn't make the news. It wouldn't go viral. But it mattered. Because real change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. In a courtroom, in a policy update, in the way someone treats a stranger who walks in alone and unsure. The story of the arrogant judge and the quiet man became part of the courthouse's hidden history, like the scuff marks on the floor or the faint echo in the hallway. Not celebrated, but remembered. Not as entertainment, but as a lesson. That dignity isn't in the title you hold, but in how you treat the person standing before you. And in the end, that's what stuck. Not the arrest, not the charges, not even the fall from grace. It was the reminder that the law belongs to everyone, not just those who wear robes, but those who show up scared, confused, or broke, hoping for a fair shot. And when someone forgets that, the system, slow, imperfect, but persistent, has a way of correcting course. Not with vengeance, not with spectacle, but with a folded warrant, a calm voice, and the quiet certainty that no one is above the rules we all agree to live by. Today, if you walk into that courthouse, you'll see the same marble floors, the same wooden benches, the same American flag in the corner. But if you listen closely, you might hear something else too. The echo of a truth that doesn't need shouting. That justice works best when it's humble, when it's human, and when it remembers that its power comes not from fear, but from fairness. And somewhere in another city, another courtroom, another quiet person is doing the same thing, showing up, speaking truth and making sure the scales stay balanced. Not for glory, not for fame, but because someone has to, and sometimes that's enough.